Hello, and welcome to Hidden Histories, November 2nd, 2020. Tomorrow is the presidential election. And in that spirit, tonight's episode focuses on voting. We're going to use the lenses of poetry, film, and the reflections of two scholars who have devoted their lives to researching the vote and election process. If you have not voted, tomorrow, please exercise your right as an American citizen and take the action to vote. Tonight, we have local performance artist Jess Mahogany Mitchell interpreting a poem by Evie Shockley, and she has a poem called Women's Voting Rights at 100, but Who's Counting? We have a documentary film tonight from 2008 by 4 students from Communication Arts High School. It is called A Shift in Representation, the 1977 City Council Reforms. It covers the struggle and eventual victory for single-member districts of the City Council for San Antonio, Texas. Tonight we're going to start the evening with Dr. Rachel Gunter, a scholar in the women's suffrage movement in Texas between 1900 and 1922. She's going to bring us insight into the legislative struggle and the divisions within the suffrage movement to allow for the participation of and the rights of Mexican American and Black women. She will also touch on some of the voting issues around the returning veterans from World War I. Dr. Henry Flores will bring us insights into his research on voter suppression and voter fraud, and explore the use of the poll tax and at-large districting as ways that kept the West Side from participating in San Antonio politics. Today is November 2nd, 2020, Dia de los Muertos. We will close the evening with a film by Ray Santisteban of URBAN-15's performance of Carnaval de los Muertos. Enjoy the show.
So I started on my master's thesis on the Brown women of Ashton Villa in Galveston, Texas, and Rebecca Brown was never married, Betty Brown as they called her. And so I was looking for more research on single women, and people said, well, why don't you look at the suffragists, assuming that some of them were single, and that led me to a book called Citizens at Last, and I was looking through, and it's got primary sources in it as well. And I turned the page, and there's a picture of Christia Adair, a Black suffragist from South Texas. And on the next page was a suffrage poster urging sufragistas to register and vote. And I realized there was a lot more to the suffrage movement in Texas than I had ever learned about. I learned a very kind of white, middle class, and Eastern version of suffrage in kind of general history courses. And I had taken a course in Holocaust film and literature history. And in that class, we had to read some female Holocaust memoirs. And I realized reading that work that the version of the Holocaust I had learned was the male experience. So it made me very curious about what the female experience of some of the other things I had learned had been. And then when you combined that with realizing that there weren't just upper class white women in the suffrage movement, it made me very curious what other people's experiences were, both in the movement and people who were affected by those changes to voting laws. For the national movement really gets started in the East as far as suffrage goes. And there's kind of starts and stops in the 19th century as far as suffrage in Texas. There's an effort with Rebecca Henry Hayes to get a suffrage organization started in the 19th century. It lasts a couple years, then it goes away. There's, some effort there, but there's no big organizing going on. They're trying, but there's just not enough kind of support there. And then you get another push in the early 20th century with Annette Finnegan. So she organizes, but the only cities that are organized are Galveston and Houston. Then she leaves the state and the whole thing kind of collapses. It's very much based on her perseverance. She comes back to the state and restarts it. And by this point, Dallas and San Antonio both have organizations. So it really grows from there. And by about 1915, the suffrage movement in Texas is pretty strong. It's throughout the state. They have dozens of chapters in different cities and towns. And they really begin to organize and show some political power as much as one can have without having actual voting rights in the state. There were a lot of stops and starts, and there's certain incidents that give more flame or fire to the movement. The Galveston hurricane of 1900 certainly got a lot of women in Galveston involved in making political requests of government in a way they hadn't been before, and some of those women will go on to be a big part of this movement. The progressive movement was a big part of it. And I think also the Mexican Revolution and fighting against racial violence was part of it for other groups as well. So within each community, women wanted the right to vote for different things. Whatever that community is working for is what they're wanting the right to vote for. So in South Texas, this could be just basic safety, especially for African American women throughout the state, safety, better education for their kids, which we know the state is not fully funding public education for Black and brown students. They may also be opposed to child labor and want to be able to both provide for an education for their kids, but not have to have them working, and they think it's a bad thing that these kids are working. Minnie Fisher Cunningham regularly references seeing little boys selling newspapers and working during the day when she thinks those children should be in school, and she's not wrong. Some of them also want to clean up the food and especially milk supply. So Cunningham argues that she kind of rode a wave of spoiled milk into suffrage because she's worried about what these companies are selling to kids, and there's no, mechanism in the early 1900s to make sure that those products are safe. So there's all sorts of things that these women want. It just depends on their particular place within their communities and their politics. But just making claims on government is a big deal for these women to be doing, especially in an organized manner within these suffrage groups. Prohibition is also an issue in this day and age, and a lot of the women were prohibition or supported prohibition. Some of that is because they really think drinking is a bad thing and it's creating all these other problems with domestic violence and men, drinking away the budget and the kids going hungry and those sorts of things. Some of it's just because prohibition also brought a lot of big liquor money against progressive issues. So the liquor lobby is paying a lot to make sure women don't get the right to vote. And so some of it's more pragmatic in that sense. There were several different groups whose voting rights were affected by the changes that gave us women's suffrage, and by changes that suffragists pushed for. So the first major group is a group we call declarant immigrants. So a declarant immigrant is someone who has come into the United States, come into Texas. They've been in the state long enough to apply for citizenship, and they have filed what we call their first papers to become citizens, but they haven't completed that process yet. And in 2/3 of the United States, at some point in either their state or territorial history, declarant immigrants were allowed to vote, and that's true in the state of Texas. So especially in the context of World War I and all of the nationalism and patriotism that went along with that war and the quashing of dissent, the fact that immigrants could vote concerned a lot of progressive Texans, especially when you consider that the two largest groups of immigrants in the state were Germans and Mexicans, and the Zimmerman telegram, in which Germany tried to get Mexico to invade Texas and the southern United States, is part of the reason the U.S. was in the war in the first place. So that becomes very controversial. When women get primary suffrage in 1918, the state passes, as part of that law, a law that says those declarant immigrants can't vote in primaries now. So they can't take away their right to vote in general elections without a state constitutional amendment, but they can pass just a regular law to affect primary voting. So that's the first way that we see suffrage kind of limiting other groups' voting rights. In 1919, there's a state constitutional amendment as well that would have enfranchised women, but would have required all voters to be citizens for the first time. That fails. Texas ratifies the 19th Amendment anyway, which goes into effect in 1920. And in 1921, we see another constitutional amendment that would again limit all voting to citizens, and it would allow a spouse to pay their spouse's poll tax, effectively making it easier for white women to vote. They wouldn't have to go pay the poll tax themselves. Their husbands could do it. And that passes. So the amendment to restrict suffrage to citizens fails in 1919, but once women have the right to vote, they help pass it in 1921. Another group that is severely affected by some of the changes out of suffrage are Black voters in the state. Of course, Black men technically have the right to vote, but both the poll tax and the all-white primary work to make sure that most Black men are not going to be able to exercise that right. And the few Black women who are able to register and especially to actually vote after 1920 scares the Texas legislature so badly that by 1923, they legislate the all-white primary. Up to that point in time, it had been up to the Democratic Party to decide who was or wasn't able to be a member. Now the state was saying that, no, you must be white to vote in the white primary. And the nice thing about that, if you can think of it that way, is that it's kind of the Achilles heel of the all-white primary. By legislating it, they open themselves up to constitutional challenges that will eventually lead the Supreme Court to strike down the all-white primary and overturn it as unconstitutional. And then the final group that I focus on whose voting rights really change are soldiers and veterans. So if you joined the military in the state of Texas, you lost the right to vote for the length of your service, and this goes back to the original state constitution. And veterans as well, if they're returning from World War I and they get home after the poll tax window has closed on February 1st, then they're still disfranchised for the rest of the year. And that becomes a very big deal in that 1919 state constitutional amendment for women's suffrage and to require citizenship of voters. So there's this campaign that starts with different newspaper editors saying, no one intended to bar, good servicemen from voting. So just show up, in your uniforms with your discharge papers, and the election judges will surely let you vote, even though it's illegal, right? They'll let you do it anyway. And so suffragists get on board with this and try to get a law passed that would make this legal for returning servicemen who are out of the service now to vote on their discharge papers. So they help get that passed. And Cunningham, the leader of the Texas Equal Suffrage Association, admits privately in a letter to Carrie Chapman Catt that the real reason they get that passed is they fear that what these judges are really asking people to do is to just not turn away any soldier who shows up, and that they intend to have Carranza's army cross into South Texas and vote. So they think that actually by making it legal for these returning soldiers to vote, that they're preventing what they would see as voter fraud, right? Bringing in people from Mexico, not really immigrants, but actually marching the Mexican army into South Texas to vote against women's suffrage. But there are unintended consequences to changing election laws, especially after the 14th Amendment. So for example, Texas ratifies the 19th Amendment. Everything seems fine, right? We're coming up to 1920, presidential election, women can vote. And out of nowhere, out of nowhere, Governor Hobby calls a special session of the legislature. So they all show up, and Hobby announces that he's checked with the Attorney General. And based on the 19th Amendment, the poll tax in Texas is unconstitutional because it only applies to men. And the 19th Amendment says you can't discriminate based on sex in voting. So that's discrimination. So they have unintentionally thrown out the poll tax in the state of Texas, one of only 2 Jim Crow voting restrictions the state has. And Hobby gives this wonderful speech to the legislature about the dangers of a wide open election and how they must get this fixed. This is 6 weeks before the presidential election. And they do get it fixed, right? They apply the poll tax to men and women. They set up a way to register and just to make sure that the poll tax can be enforced. They never intended to throw out the poll tax, but because of how the ways voting rights interact, that's kind of what happened. We also see suffragists either deploy or retract some of these racist or nativist arguments when they think it will help their cause. So for example, when the 19th Amendment is moving through Congress, some of the NASA suffragists contact Texas and say, you need to be really careful not to talk about the all-white primary. We cannot talk about the fact that this is not going to enfranchise Black women, because we need those congressmen in the North who would have a problem with that to vote on the 19th Amendment and support it. And so they strategically withdraw some of these arguments in places to make sure that their larger goal is met. The Texas Equal Suffrage Association, or TESA, was not explicitly, but in reality, an all-white organization. They did have a case of a group from El Paso, a group of Black suffragists, who had gone to a group of white women in their suffrage organization and asked for training. And so these two groups are working together. I do think it's very interesting that Black and white women are more willing to work together in context where there's a large Latino population, and maybe they can find some common ground there. But they're training these Black women and how to organize and those sorts of things. And the Black group of suffragists knows they can't just join TESA, the state organization, but they want to join NASA, the National American Woman Suffrage Association. So they write directly to NASA to ask to join. NASA sends it back to TESA saying, what's going on here? You already have an organization in El Paso, right? Is there a split going on? What's happening? So TESA has to write to the white suffragist in El Paso and figure this out. And they realize that Deborah Sampson is a Black woman. And so then TESA freaks out a little bit. They contact Carrie Chapman Catt again and say, what do we do here? You know, having a Black suffrage organization is not going to help our cause in a southern state like Texas, or even a western state like Texas. And so basically Catt and then Cunningham write back to Sampson and say, you know, it would be best if you just rescind this attempt to join our organization. Like, we'll be able to get the right for all of us, even though they know it's not for all of us, if you just step aside. So we do see those connections on the ground in local areas between white and Black women. We also see a lot of church groups within the Black community that organize for suffrage. In Orange, Texas, there's a group that goes in 1918 and demands the right to register, even though they know they're not going to be able to vote in the all-white primary. And when they're turned away, they sue. And it is this group of women who organized at their church and made an announcement on Sunday morning that we're going to go the next day to register, that starts that type of organizing. As far as Latinos, we don't have groups of Latino women who are organizing in the same ways. We have individuals where suffrage is part of their conversation, like Jovita Idar, but they're not organizing groups around suffrage, and they're known for far more things than just suffrage. It's one thing on their plate. And frankly, Latino women in South Texas in the 19-teens have a lot of stuff on their plate. So the 19th Amendment, there's a lot of myth making about it, right? So the one that bothers me the most is the idea that the 19th gave women the right to vote. It did no such thing. All it does is prevent states from turning people away based on their sex. So Black women don't get the right to vote, especially not with the all-white primary and the poll tax. Poor white women, women whose husbands don't want them to vote and aren't willing to pay their poll tax because they don't own their own money, right? Everything's basically under their husband's name. There are so many women who don't get the right to vote based on the 19th Amendment. There is no positive constitutional right to vote. States can limit voting on any basis they want, as long as it doesn't violate the 15th Amendment about race or the 19th Amendment about sex. And we're seeing that play out today. There's lots of different ways to prevent people from voting. So this idea that the 19th enfranchised all women or gave women the right to vote, that there's any kind of positive constitutional right to vote, is clearly the largest myth I run into. There's two things to watch for when it comes to changes in voting laws. One is that when you're in a time of political competition, there is an incentive for politicians to either enfranchise a group to stay in power or to disfranchise a group to stay in power. And I think anytime one party starts to go after one or both of those options, they open up the other party to do the same. We often see voting rights change over a series of times. So if one law about voting rights changes this year, you're going to see future changes to voting laws as well. So it's not something that's going to stay super static. So if we have all these changes to voting rights going on, if there's this effort to disfranchise groups, then the other party is going to make efforts to enfranchise groups. And we've already seen talk of that, looking at American territories, looking at DC statehood, and those types of things. The second thing would be that there are always unintended consequences to changing voting laws, because again, under the 14th Amendment, you can't just explicitly say this group can't vote, right? You have to get a little sneaky with it, which is what we're seeing with these efforts to create really long lines to vote in certain parts of the state, especially Black and brown parts of the state, and in large cities that tend to vote more Democratic. And I think it's important that we put those issues in context, right? That kind of wait, where you're waiting 6, 7, 8 hours, that's a poll tax, right? It is costing you more to vote because the people in power don't like the way you're voting, right? Whereas I can go, to my polling place in a fairly affluent area, took less than 5 minutes. So I think we need to interpret these attempts at limiting voting within our larger historical context of Jim Crow voting laws, of poll taxes, of all-white primaries and such. But we also need to understand that there's always unintended consequences to these things, like the state legislature not realizing that the 19th Amendment voided the poll tax. There will always be something that politicians don't plan for when they're messing with voting rights. I'm very excited about this documentary. It's going to be called Citizens at Last. It's about the women's suffrage movement in Texas. It's really getting started with about 1900 and the Great Storm in Galveston, and how many of the women who end up being part of the suffrage movement kind of get their start asking and demanding things of government in that time period. And it also addresses Black voting in Texas, Latina and immigrant voting in Texas, as well as to what's going on in the state in the early 20th century as far as prison labor is concerned. And that's a lot of how we get railroads into South Texas, which changes demographics there. So I'm really excited about that documentary and how it's going to kind of educate people about what suffrage looked like in Texas, where it's not such a white kind of middle class story, where there's a lot of women and a lot of different voting rights in play, whether that's Black men, servicemen, immigrants, women. There's a lot to that story there that I think people don't realize. So I'm looking forward to that. The documentary comes out during Women's History Month, March 2021, and should air on local PBS stations in Texas.
Women's Voting Rights at 100, but Who's Counting? A poem by Evie Shockley. Eeny, meeny, miny, mo, catch a voter by her toe. If she hollers, then you know, got yourself a real Jane Crow. One vote is an opinion with a quiet legal force, a barely audible beep in the local traffic, and just a plashless drop of mercury in the national thermometer. But a collectivity of votes, a flock of votes, a pride of votes, a murder of votes, can really make some noise. One vote begets another if you make a habit of it. My mother started taking me to the polls with her when I was 7. Small, thrilled to step in the booth, pull the drab curtain hush shut behind us, and flip the levers beside each name she pointed to, the X's clicking into view. There, she called the shots. Rich gal, poor gal, hired girl, thief, teacher, journalist, vote your grief. One vote's as good as another. Still, in 1913, Illinois's gentle suffragist, hearing Southern women would resent spotting Mrs. Ida B. Wells Barnett amidst white marchers, gently kicked their sister to the curb. But when the march kicked off, Ida got right into formation as planned. The Tribune's photo showed her present and accounted for. One vote can be hard to keep an eye on, but several, a colony of votes, can't scuttle away unnoticed so easily. My mother, veteran registrar for our majority Black election district, once found, after much searching, 2 bags of ballots, a litter of votes, stuffed in a janitorial closet. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippis. 1 vote was all Fannie Lou Hamer wanted. In 1962, when her constitutional right was over 40 years old, she tried to register. All she got for her trouble was literacy tested, poll taxed, fired, evicted, and shot at. A year of grassroots activism nearly planted her Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party in the National Convention. 1 vote per eligible voter was all Stacey Abrams needed. She nearly won the Georgia governor's race in 2018, lost by 50,000, an unkindness of votes, to the man whose job was maintaining the voter rolls. Days later, she rolled out plans for getting voters a fair fight. It's been 2 years and counting.
When I was a young boy, I was introduced to, I guess, West Side politics by my grandparents, who spoke about it often at the kitchen table, and of the various politicians who served our area. I became aware of inequities at a very young age in the political process because I couldn't understand how the West Side was so underdeveloped economically compared to different sides of the town, and why people were poor. I kept asking those questions all the way through high school, and then when I was in the military, that's when I became aware of overt racism, and eventually that led me into studying political science, because I felt that the fault of all of that might lie in the political system itself. So I wanted to try to understand it and maybe possibly do something about it. Throughout the decades, Texas has seemed to try to create barriers to participation. It's almost like the state politicians don't want people to vote. They try to minimize the vote by doing a lot of different things. And when they do that, it costs folks as far as time and resources to cast a ballot because they have to overcome these barriers. So, for instance, the classic one was the poll tax. The poll tax at one time was $1.50 a voter, so you had to really pay the tax. They'd give you a little receipt, and you had to show that receipt at the polling place before you voted. The problem was the $1.50 tax today doesn't sound like much, but back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, $1.50 went a long way. You could buy a loaf of bread for a nickel or a dime, for instance. And so $1.50 was pretty prohibitive to a working class family. And the larger the family, the more prohibitive it got. So that's an example of a cost. Some of the other barriers were things like registration and re-registration. There were times where there were literacy tests required. If you spoke Spanish, you couldn't bring any assistants into the polling place to vote. So however you figured out who the candidates were you were going to vote for, it was going to cost you money to either hire someone to do the translations for you ahead of time or things of that nature. And then, of course, there were transportation costs, going to and from the polls. There were also a lack of early voting sites at one particular time. Matter of fact, currently there was a recent state district court decision requiring Bexar County to have more polling places for early voting, or actually on election day, excuse me. There were times that at one point there was also some redistricting issues involved. But little by little, what happened in Texas was that, and where that data came from is a national study that's being conducted by three professors who have been looking at every state in the union to look at which are the most restrictive places to vote. And Texas won the prize this year for being the state that is the most restrictive place to vote in the entire United States of America. In the old days in San Antonio, the Hatch Act, well, I guess I have to go step back just a little bit in history, but one of the reasons that it affected the Mexican-American community so much was that we had this large generation of Mexican-American GIs coming back from World War II, and one of the best places for employment at the time to make a decent wage and be able to afford a home was working for the federal government. So you find a lot of Mexican-American veterans working at Kelly Air Force Base, for instance. Some worked at Fort Sam Houston, and then the other was at some of the other Air Force bases, but the biggest employer was at Kelly, which had a huge logistics center at the time, and logistics and maintenance center. And so that Mexican-American population was very large. My father worked there. I think Henry Cisneros' dad worked there. Alex Briceño's father worked there. We could trace back a whole generation of the Mexican-American middle class of my generation. Their parents all worked at Kelly. And a lot of them were very politically knowledgeable and very politically interested, and wanted to do things to better the community as far as the political process was concerned. But it was prohibited for them to participate politically because of the Hatch Act. So in a funny sort of way, an act that was designed to make the federal employee neutral and be free from political influence actually worked against the Mexican-American community, because it kind of didn't allow a lot of very knowledgeable and talented Mexican-Americans to participate in the political process. They voted in large numbers, but they still couldn't really take an active role in politics because of that law. Well, my earliest, the political activists or politicians who have become most important in helping the Mexican-American community become a political force, you could probably begin with, in the contemporary historical period, the late Congressman Henry B. Gonzalez, who ran for city council in the 1950s, and he had to run at large, and it was very difficult for a Mexicano. There was only one other Mexicano who held an at-large office in the city, and that was Gus Garcia, who was sitting on the San Antonio School District Board. Gonzalez did it by organizing the Mexicano vote on the West Side to vote as a block for him, and he barely won. And then again, he won re-election. But the most important part of his campaign was that, of his time in office, was that he fought against a lot of segregation bills that the city was trying to pass to get around the Brown versus Board of Education decision that was being passed. And so a lot of it had to do with desegregating commercial places of business, restaurants, retail outlets, things of that nature, theaters, public parks and recreation. He helped connect with the African American community to put pressure on the city council to do these kinds of things as well. And then when he went off to the state senate, he did the same thing. He set a record for the longest filibuster in history in the Texas State Senate at that time, doing the same thing because the state of Texas was trying to pass some segregation laws. That kind of exposure created an atmosphere where more and more Mexicanos were beginning to look at what was going on. Along with him at that time was Albert Peña, working on the West Side as well, the late great Judge Albert Peña, who helped create a Mexicano liberal coalition in local politics to try to move issues, to try to find candidates to get elected and organizing the electorate. Along with him were characters like Lalo Solis, for instance. State Senator Joe Bernal came along as a slightly younger generation. And he carried a lot of issues forward in the state senate, so much so that eventually his re-election campaigns were undermined by conservative forces because he was too liberal to be in the state senate at the time. Later on the city council, you had Pete Torres, who did a lot to bring a lot of issues forward. Then in contemporary era, later was Henry Cisneros, who became the youngest city council member in San Antonio at the time, and eventually became the mayor and was mayor for a long, long time here in San Antonio, eventually rising to be Secretary of Housing and Urban Development in the Clinton administration. He himself became a role model that created the foundation for a lot of other young Latino politicians and to come forth and run for office. Maria Berriozabal, who was on the city council for a long time, she was a very big champion of, and still is, she's a community activist of poor folks' interests and rights. In the community, we've had just a whole history of Andy Sarabia of COPS, for instance, was very big in helping establish COPS and have them be the voice of the folks in the community who didn't really have a way of expressing their opinion with the local elected officials, followed by, Juan Padlan at the Mexican American Unity Council, and the list goes on. So I guess beginning with Henry B. all the way to the present, the population numbers just to keep expanding and growing. The largest threat to our voting rights in Bexar County is, I think, the state's interference in organizing against, in limiting the number of ballot drop-off locations for mail-in ballots and absentee ballots to one. For the most part, the other thing was the elimination of straight ticket voting. Also did something to confuse the voters, I think, to a certain extent. As a matter of fact, my wife was a straight ticket voter, and she said, "How am I going to vote now?" And I said, "You're just going to have some patience and go office by office." And she said, "I will." And so that's the way she straight ticketed voted at this time. But that in itself confused a lot of voters. I think the second part is the voter ID laws, and can tend to be confusing to some voters, and that cuts into turnout. We have a lot of research in American political science that shows that voter ID laws, next to registration laws, are pretty restrictive as far as keeping people from voting. So that's another one that's very big. So those are the biggest threats for me as far as I can see. It seems like we just close the window on participation every time we pass a law, more and more. And those are all coming out of the state government. One of the most important thing we have to do is elect candidates, elect politicians who will participate in the redistricting processes in such a way that they draw honest lines for both the U.S. Congress districts, the state representative and state Senate districts, and then later on for the city council districts. One of the biggest issues in the city of San Antonio coming that's going to confront us right after the census is conducted or reported is we're going to have to redraw the San Antonio City Council districts. And one of the big debates that's going to be, do we need to have more city council people because the city's gotten larger? And if so, what does that mean? Are we going to lose single member districts, or are we going to have some combination of single member districts and at large? But if you really want to have a representative government for the city of San Antonio, you're going to have to look at city council members who speak the language of representation to the people in such a way that whatever our configuration looks like in the future, it will be representative of our citizenry. The thing we have to learn to do to become more politically literate is to go beyond the ads that people see. The ads are designed to push you away from the polls or to pull you to the polls, depending on who's designing the ads. You have to almost disregard that, those. And you have to look at the candidates, and the higher up as far as the positions are concerned. For instance, for the presidency of the United States, you're not just voting for one person, you're voting for a whole series of policies. So you have to understand, you have to think about what it looks like in the big picture. Not look at one issue, but look at an array of issues to see which one is more compatible with you. And then the second thing you have to think about is that you're not just voting for one person. You're going to be voting for an individual who's going to appoint 3,000 to 4,000 different individuals to different offices, different ministries and cabinet offices and people below those. Who, you have to ask the question, what type of people is that person going to put in office? It requires some sophistication, it requires some research, but you have to really understand those types of elections at that depth. On a city level, you have to do the same thing, but the work isn't that difficult. You have to try to go to meetings, go to neighborhood association meetings, go to places where politicians are talking, and ask them hard questions about the city budget, about police and fire protection, about city streets, about things that are important to the quality of life of city citizens. Because I always used to tell my students, and I still do when I am teaching city politics or urban politics, that frankly the most important governmental level in the whole United States for the citizen is your city government, because they're the ones who provide your quality of life. They pave your streets, they make sure the cops are paid, they make sure that the fire departments are properly staffed and equipped, to make sure the EMS folks are properly educated and certified, and they're the ones that protect you and take care of you on a daily basis. And so you should really try to understand who those politicians are, how they're going to spend your money, because you pay for these services through your tax dollars, and then cast your votes as best you can, knowing that we all make mistakes sometimes when we cast votes, but try to cast a good quality vote. Do I have great optimism for the experiment called democracy? Frankly, I do. My wife accuses me of being a glass half full guy anyway, so and we balance each other off quite well, but in that respect. But I do. I've seen, in my lifetime, I've seen administrations that have been really horrible from my perception about different sorts of policies, like in foreign areas of foreign policy, for instance, and some that have been very, very good, and some that have been very mediocre. But for some reason or other, we're still around and we're still living our lives relatively well. I mean, we still have a lot of poverty, and we still have a lot of public health issues, and we have an educational system that needs a lot of reforming. But having lived in a lot of different countries and seen a lot of different countries around the world, we do pretty well, really. And so I think for the future of democracy, I like to be optimistic about it. We're seeing a lot of authoritarian governments out there right now, but authoritarian governments eventually get in their own way because they want so much control that eventually people will revolt against them. And we're beginning to see a lot of demonstrations in a lot of cities around the world, even in places like Turkey. Even in Russia, they're having a lot of opposition against their prime minister, who's also fits the authoritarian kind of category quite well. In Argentina, you're seeing demonstrations. You're seeing them in Venezuela. You're seeing them in just a lot of different countries in the Americas. Mexico, there's some. And that's because in democracy, people express their opinions, and for the most part, they're allowed to. And any type of authoritarian government can have a lot of trouble that way. Now, they could fall into a dictatorship, but even dictatorships fall eventually. Democracies give you a certain amount of freedom and liberty, that understanding that you have to be careful not to step on the feet of your next door neighbor when you're exercising your liberty and your freedom, that is precious. And for me, the way you maintain it in our particular democracy is by voting. And so for me, the vote is is probably the most important constitutionally protected right we have in this society, and we can't allow anybody to take it away or denigrate it or inhibit it in any which way possible.
I mentioned earlier we're going to be watching a 2008 documentary film, A Shift in Representation, the 1977 City Council Reforms. It was produced by 4 students from Communication Arts High School here in San Antonio as a student project. It's significant because there have been very few documentaries made on this really important process that changed elections in San Antonio. The 1977 reforms, it took 13 years to get this straight, and this film is significant. You can follow it. You can see the players. It is a very important documentary, so enjoy it.
People that you really wanted in office would very seldom have the kind of money that would take to go on radio or television or to buy signs. It would be very difficult to raise money from people that you knew, so that you had to go to the business community, to the people that had money. This would negate a lot of good people that were of great means and kept them from running. Let me put it in a very caustic, simple way. You never could vote for someone that you really wanted in office, because the rest of the city would cancel you out. Under the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, everybody is supposed to get equal protection under the law.
And historically, there was underrepresentation for the Mexican American community, for sure, and often for the African American community as well.
You had something that happened in '76. San Antonio was at large. They had 8 and the mayor, and the 8 were running at large. There was an effort to extend San Antonio's boundaries north.
Given the ethnic and racial distribution throughout the county, there was a concentration, for instance, on the west side and the south side of Mexican Americans, a concentration on the east side of African Americans, and virtually all of the elected officials were from the north side of San Antonio.
Between 1945 and 72, we plotted on the map where the people lived that had been elected to city council. And we plotted, I guess it must have been 50 addresses, people that had been elected between 40 and 70. And all of them lived north of Hildebrand. None of them lived south of Hildebrand. There was, except for one, Pete Torres, had been elected by chance.
When you go north, you go white. And everybody knew that if you went towards the airport and out 281 and out Bandera Road, that you were going to go into white areas.
That if all the representatives are from the north side, then where do you think the money is going to be spent for streets and roads and drainage and the like? Without representatives from your community at the table to discuss matters, there is not the forceful arguments made that there should be a sharing of the goods of the society. The predominant informal group was the Good Government League. The Good Government League was generally an extension, the political arm of the business elites of the city. They had opened up in their eyes to about where they would have one African American and then one Mexican American moving up to 2 Mexican Americans.
What they did, to say that they were not against Mexicans or against blacks, they would say, okay, there's a nice black over there and there's a nice Mexican over there. We'll pick you. Reverend so-and-so, and we'll pick you over here because you're a well-behaved businessman that owned something, a Mexican that owned something in the city. There was a lot of interconnections there between the business community, the TV and radio, the media, and the newspapers, all coming together to support someone not making too much noise.
Sure. At-large elections are where a county or a city would elect all of the representatives on its legislative body from the entire county or the entire city.
When you have the at-large system, you put up candidates and you run, and since we're a minority, the majority will elect all the officials. What happens is when you do this, you keep running them and they lose and they lose and they lose. Eventually the Hispanics or the minorities start saying, why vote? Why participate? We can't win.
Well, the strategy was to use the Voting Rights Act to force the city to adopt, to abandon the at-large elections. And it was kind of like a bank shot in pool. But, you know, a bank shot in pool works just as well as a head-on shot.
We took that to court, and the court found that that was violated the Voting Rights Act. And it ordered that the city be divided into 10 districts. And immediately, we ended up having 5 minorities elected.
Districting is the breaking down, the cutting of the pie into slices so that each different geographical community elects its representatives.
Usually Hispanics or blacks or African Americans will be represented then by the process of drawing districts.
This city council, instead of having just 2 Mexicans and 1 black, consistently, you know, persistently and historically, pretty soon we'll have the majority.
There had to be a Justice Department clearance, there had to be the breaking down of the city and the movement from at-large to single-member districts. And that changed the complexion of the city council for sure. But I think that without question it's led to incredibly positive changes. That all of a sudden the streets started to get repaired on the east side, that drainage started to be placed on the west side, that there were infrastructure projects throughout the south side.
I think the city is thriving. I still think there's a lot of work to do. There's a lot more to be done. I think that, you know, when you open doors and you make the democratic process work better, I think it enriches. People come to San Antonio because of the Latino culture, and so we have a lot more to offer. People are involved, and yeah, it's been very, very positive.
And you know, I really think it was I personally feel it was very positive for the city. And winning the single-member district case really isn't even the end of it. The end of it is, or that what's important is that every 10 years then those districts have to be redrawn when the census comes out to equalize the population. And they would get the districts, force them into districts, get a fairly good district plan, and then when the decade come up that there had to be redistricting, they would hire some right-wing law firm to do that.
We tend to think that constituents choose their elected representatives, but one can turn that on its head during redistricting and say that it's really the representatives that are choosing their constituents because they have a voice in the drawing of the lines of their own districts.
It's an issue that has to do very basically with democratic representation. The Supreme Court Justice Warren, Earl Warren, said that that was the most important issue that he had in the, I don't know how many years he served as a Supreme Court Justice in the United States, that was the most important issue that he had to live through as a Supreme Court Justice. It's not an issue that creates an emotion. It's a very cold issue, but it's very important. It's a very important issue.
You know, these cases, the unfairness and inequities was so obvious.
I personally believe in Jeffersonian democracy. I mean, it's what the country's made out of, and to create a situation here where people couldn't get elected was, I mean, was a bad situation.
And you have to have equality in numbers, fairness in, against the racial minorities and ethnic minorities. That is part of our culture now in the United States. Made the United States of America a real democracy, or closer to being a real, there's no real democracy, but closer to getting a real democracy and real true representation, which are never perfect, but as close as you could get to it was because people got involved in this issue.
I hope you enjoyed tonight's evening. Each of our featured guests gave us a lot to think about, and they offered great insights and brought me information I hadn't heard before. Next month's Hidden Histories episode is the final episode of Season 3. It's hard to believe that we've gone 36 months of Hidden Histories. We have special guests which will bring us their insights about this program, and we will feature some of the highlights of those 36 months. That is on December 7th, 2020. If you haven't voted, please vote tomorrow. Take time and take action. Remember, artists vote in color.